Hello, I'm Cyril Vanier. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the global race for electric cars is at full speed, and the competition to dominate the industry is driving geopolitical rivalries. Also this week, hitting bumps in the road. What are the challenges facing the widespread adoption of electric vehicles, or EVs? Plus, car makers are investing billions to develop these electric vehicles, but how green are they compared to those powered by fossil fuels? So for every 7 cars sold around the world last year, 1 was electric. And global sales of electric cars are expected to set yet another record this year. Governments around the world are offering incentives to buy cleaner cars. All of this, of course, part of a push to reduce carbon emissions. China is leading the race right now, but U.S. President Joe Biden wants to change that. He is spending billions of dollars to boost production in the U.S. The EU, meanwhile, is playing catch-up and investigating allegations that Beijing isn't playing by the rules. Fintan Monahan reports.
U.S. President Joe Biden believes in an electric future. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, American car companies are getting major tax breaks for investing in electric vehicles, or EVs. Consumers can also get as much as $7,500 in tax credits. Speaking to auto workers, Biden promised America would remain an industry leader and fend off foreign competition.
Folks, since I took office, our nation has invested billions to supercharge advanced manufacturing here at home, including electric vehicles. China is determined to dominate the electric vehicle market by using unfair trade practices. But I will not let them.
China recently overtook Japan to become the world's biggest car exporter. Much of that was thanks to EVs. Analysts say Chinese companies could control a third of the global market by 2030. A lot of their success comes down to price. They sell for nearly half the price of their competitors. The US and Europe accuse Beijing of breaking global trade rules, and the EU has opened an investigation.
I welcome the probe launched by EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen on subsidies for Chinese companies in China. If those subsidies do not conform with the rules of the World Trade Organization, Europe must act.
But China also controls supplies of materials that are essential for making EV components. Shortly after the EU announced its investigation, China imposed restrictions on graphite. The government claims the move wasn't retaliation.
The Chinese government implements export controls according to the law, which don't target any country or region or any specific sector. China is committed to protecting the security and stability of the global supply chain.
Despite some friction, the global EV sector is still booming. For now, governments are more focused on boosting their own production rather than blocking their competitors. Welcome news for supporters of the electric transition. Fintan Monahan for Counting the Cost.
Sales of EVs have jumped in the past few years. In 2021, just over 6 million electric cars were sold worldwide. By 2023 now, that number more than doubled to nearly 14 million. And the market that is really driving this growth is China. 8 million electric cars sold there in 2023, which means China now accounts for more than half of all new electric cars sold worldwide. So let's bring in our panel. Joining us from London is Andy Leyland, the Managing Director of Supply Chain Insights. And from Beijing, I am joined also by Andy Mock. Andy is a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Let's start in London with Andy Leyland. So Andy, there's this major shift in the market towards electric vehicles. As we've been explaining, the world is moving, even if slowly, towards EVs. And yet, there isn't massive demand for them yet. Yes, it is growing, but it's not massive. Explain that.
So the move to electric vehicles is not just a consumer choice. It's driven by a political mandate. Lots of countries with targets to move towards zero-emission vehicles, of which lithium-ion batteries and electric vehicles are the winning technology. And they're basically forcing the vehicle producers to produce these electric vehicles, of which lithium-ion is the winning technology there. And, I'd say it's not just consumer choice. So consumers are having to do this because that's what is being built. And increasingly in the future, they will have no choice but to buy electric.
Andy Mock, you're in Beijing. China is the world leader in electric vehicles. They perhaps saw this coming, or the importance of the electric vehicle industry before others did, and they invested massively in it before others did. Explain how China came to have this dominant position.
Sure. And I would make one minor amendment
Go
to
ahead.
what you just said. And this is that it is not progressing slowly in China at all. If you look
Right.
in major cities like Beijing and Shanghai, electric vehicles are ubiquitous. And I think that William Gibson, the science fiction writer, said that the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. So how did this happen in China? I think, first of all, it's the union of policy formulation and policy execution, not just at the national level, not just at the provincial level, but down to the municipal and even the neighborhood level. So that was one very important factor. I think a very strong, well-developed science and technology ecosystem is the second factor. And then finally, just a large market. So when we look at these three factors together, I think this is what accounts for the differential that we see. And I agree with Andy in London that around the world, this is being adopted perhaps at a somewhat slower pace than in China. And it's not entirely consumer driven. But I think people all around the world, organizations all around the world, recognize the importance of sustainability. And this is one of the most important drivers for the adoption of electric vehicles.
Okay, so that's helpful because you've reminded us that there is essentially like two stories or a two-speed system when we're looking at EVs around the world. The adoption rate is higher in China and it's lower in the US and the EU. So Andy Leyland, I come back to you. The US and EU playing catch up essentially. What's it going to take for them to become powerhouses in this area and for them to catch up with China?
So the US and EU have really sort of fallen behind in developing not just electric vehicles, but the electric vehicle supply chain. They also have the issue that it's very expensive to produce a vehicle and its entire supply chain. And they're now being asked, the legacy automotive, to have two supply chains for internal combustion and for electric vehicles. And that's not sustainable. So they're having to make this large transition. And that's really helping new entrant Chinese companies. But it's also helping, the likes of Tesla who don't have all these legacy supply chains. The other issue that they have is that effectively what they need to do is massively subsidize these industries to catch up with China. And even then, they probably won't be able to without having some form of protectionist measures. And I think we're going to see those introduced in Europe relatively soon. In the US, obviously, we've already had the Inflation Reduction Act.
Well, speaking of protectionist measures, speaking of subsidies, the Europeans and the Americans actually accuse China of having subsidized its market, and with the EU going a little further, saying in ways that may be unfair, right, to its competitors, the US and the EU. Is that a cloud? Is this accusation and this investigation, because as we said earlier, the EU is now investigating China over this, is that a cloud, Andy Mock, on the horizon for Beijing? Should they be worried about this investigation into their subsidies for the EV industry?
Well, I think it certainly is a concern for Chinese EV makers because many of them are looking to be global players. So anytime a major market raises regulatory competitive concerns, this, of course, is an issue. I think at the Chinese national government level, of course, concerns have been raised about this as well, because China has very much been an advocate for greater market openness and a level playing field. And I think we have to point out here, too, that whether or not these subsidies, other forms of support and encouragement are fair or not, really, where you stand depends on where you sit, meaning that whose interests are being harmed here. And clearly, as Andy in London just mentioned, the Europeans, especially countries like Germany, have long held dominant positions in the internal combustion engine vehicle space, and certainly have a lot to lose. So I think it's not surprising at all that the EU is raising these concerns, and how valid they are, I think, really is a very contentious question.
Andy Leyland in London. Then, about these subsidies, the U.S., of course, has done something pretty major about it, which is called the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's a set of incentives for production to be relocated back to the U.S., including for electric vehicles. That's working, isn't it? From a U.S. perspective, I mean.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, since that was announced, you've had over 75 major projects announced. Over $80 billion in investment, creating over 50,000 primary jobs, and there's a lot more to come. So the Inflation Reduction Act, just because it is incredibly generous with the subsidies that it gives, is being successful in the US. The issue that it has is it's actually drawing investment away from Europe into the US, because you have these companies looking to set up plants, and they look at the incentive system in Europe, and they look at the incentive system in the US, and at the moment it's a no-brainer. You get 10% plus more subsidy in the US. So in some respects, we're slowing down the move to EVs in Europe.
One pretty major thing I haven't asked either of you yet is about the supply chain. Andy Mock, China is also the powerhouse when it comes to the supply chain. Yes, they can build the end product, the actual car, but they are also the leaders in terms of all the little steps, well, not little, but all the steps that it takes to source the raw materials in order to get to the end product. How did China become dominant in that space?
Sure, and that's actually a very important point. So first, I think it's worth mentioning that the most important component in an electric vehicle is the battery. And this requires a very high degree of scientific expertise as well as manufacturing capability. And you rightly point out that China is very strong at every part of the supply chain, from access to raw materials, cobalt, lithium, the other materials that go into batteries, go into the other parts of an electric vehicle, components, design, assembly. Of course, China has a very strong position on all of these. And I think a large part of that, again, is due to the government's ability to not only articulate and formulate detailed long-term policies, but to actually execute them. And one of the reasons for this is, I think, just the political continuity. So what we don't have in China is a new leader every 4 years or every 8 years with a concomitant, perhaps, 180-degree policy shift. So I think this is one of the most important factors, again, combined with the strong S&T, science and technology ecosystem, the large market, and the very deep ecosystem of every kind of supplier you can imagine that goes into an electric vehicle.
Gentlemen, thank you both so much for your time today. Andy Mock in Beijing, Andy Leyland in London. Thank you again. So electric cars have been on our roads for decades, and throughout the years, researchers have touted them as the future of transport. Car makers are rapidly scaling up their production of electric vehicles in response to government pressure to cut carbon emissions. But consumers are proving to be a little slower to make that switch. So what's stopping electric cars from becoming more mainstream? Well, one of the biggest barriers is a lack of charging stations. There are around 100,000 of them right now in the United States, just as an example. And U.S. President Joe Biden has pledged to boost that to 500,000 nationwide. But many consumers are still wary about how far they can go, how far they can drive with their EV. People living in cities also face challenges. Home chargers work well in the suburbs, but people in cities who park their car on the side of the road will find it more difficult to charge their vehicles. Then there's the price. On average, an EV costs around $10,000 more than a traditional car. And remember, this is a time when the global economy is already struggling. Many countries have high inflation. That means many people are well, just not keen to buy a more expensive car. While production of electric vehicles has ramped up, demand isn't growing as fast as expected. And that has led some car makers, like Tesla, for instance, to cut their prices in order to boost sales. Combined with government incentives, it has shaved thousands off the sticker price in the US. But the average cost of an EV remains. It is still over $50,000, and that is too high for many consumers. Auto workers are concerned about the impact of the transition to electric vehicles on their jobs. That's another concern. The shift to EVs is sparking political opposition in the US. Some Republicans, like Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, claim that EVs are destroying auto industry jobs because too many are imported from abroad. He wants to roll back Biden's policies that encourage people to buy electric vehicles. And meanwhile, EVs were a key issue in the recent auto workers' strike in the U.S. Protection for workers affected by the shift to EVs was part of the settlement with the car companies that ended the strike. Well, joining us now from London is Ben Scott, a senior analyst at Carbon Tracker, focusing on the automotive sector. Ben, thank you so much for joining us. There's a lot of money going into electric vehicles. The industry is moving pretty fast. What is the next significant development that you are tracking, that you are monitoring?
So I think we need to keep looking at the demand for electric vehicle sales, and that demand is actually a lot stronger than people think. So if you look at the EU, and if you look last month, electric vehicle sales were up 36% compared with a year earlier. Which is encouraging for the market. I think if you'll be forgiven to think a few years back that electric cars were being brought to market as an industry push and kind of pushed onto the consumer to meet government targets. But actually the market has changed now, and consumers are demanding these cars in significant volumes. So moving from that industry push to a consumer pull. And automakers
Ben, can I jump in there, since you're talking about demand, and it's something we've addressed earlier in the show? Is there enough demand? I appreciate you're saying it's increasing, but is there enough demand to make this transition happen and happen at pace? Because it's a whole industry that's shifting. I would argue it's not quite enough for consumers to want a few more electric vehicles. They need to want a lot more.
I think we are seeing that consumer demand, and also automakers recognize that as well. For example, we're seeing electric car investment in the Middle East. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, we're seeing Hyundai build an electric vehicle assembly plant for local electric vehicle sales. So that is a good thing for the market. And at Carbon Tracker, the way that we see electric car adoption is we see it following an S-curve. So at the beginning of the market, it will be a kind of a slow and steady increase, and then rapidly rising in the next phase of the market, and then plateauing to 100% adoption. So the growth of electric vehicle sales will be non-linear, and it'll also be a lot faster than many people expect.
What's the deciding factor for consumers now when they're buying a new car and they have to decide, combustion engine or electric vehicle? Do we know what it is that is driving their decision? Is it mostly the price? Is it the infrastructure for charging the car? Is it environmental concerns? Your views on that?
I think at the moment, in the majority of cases, it is the sticker price. And of course, in a lot of cases, the sticker price of an EV is more expensive than an internal combustion engine car. However, there are lots of new products coming to market, a lot of cheaper alternatives from some Chinese manufacturers, and Volvo, which is ultimately owned by Geely, a Chinese manufacturer, has brought a very inexpensive electric car mass market product to market as well. So these consumer options will become available, which will help with the adoption of electric cars across the vehicle segments. Historically, a lot of electric cars have started in the SUV and premium segment. So once the options come to consumers for EVs in the lower end or the volume segments for these cars, then I think we'll see more adoption.
What about the infrastructure, specifically the charging infrastructure for cars? Because if people feel it's going to be difficult to charge their cars and they can't go far enough without, it's going to be too far for them to find the next charging station, of course, that's a big stumbling block. At what point do you think, or have we perhaps already passed the point where, the floodgates are open and it's no longer so much of a barrier for consumers?
I think EV charging infrastructure is an ongoing challenge for sure, and that's not one that has been solved yet. But what's encouraging is that we're seeing more high-power charging stations being deployed in many countries. And in the US, we see a number of manufacturers making their vehicles compatible with the Tesla supercharger network, which of course has a number of charging stations worldwide. And this will enable more charging opportunities for non-Tesla EV drivers. And that will reduce range anxiety for many EV drivers as well.
Ben, stay with us. I have some questions for you on how environmentally friendly EV cars really are. Quick explainer first. As these electric cars become more popular, many people question whether they really are environmentally friendly. Now, the short answer to that is yes. Yes, they are, because they don't run on fossil fuels. That means they don't put out carbon dioxide, which is the biggest contributor to global warming. But, here's the but, while they do pump out less emissions, that doesn't tell you the whole story. The process of manufacturing an electric vehicle, you need to look at that. That produces more emissions than the making of a traditional car. Lithium-ion batteries in particular are very carbon intensive. Mining rare earth metals needed for those batteries also has an environmental impact. Digging it up can cause hazardous materials to leak out, exposing local communities. The smelting process can also contaminate the air with sulfur dioxide. And while EVs themselves produce minimal emissions when you drive them, they do rely on the power grid for their electricity. Now, if that electricity is produced from, say, coal, one of the dirtiest fossil fuels there is, then driving an electric vehicle might not have much impact on overall emissions. But as power grids get greener, so too will the EVs that they power. Ben, back to you. This makes the whole question of whether electric cars are more environmentally friendly just a little bit more confusing than is sometimes presented. Can you settle this debate for us, especially for consumers who might be thinking of investing going forward in an electric vehicle? Are they helping the planet?
Yes, the shift towards electric vehicles is certainly a good thing to help us meet our climate change goals. If you think about the vehicle life cycle, most emissions come from the use phase of the vehicle. It's often called Scope 3 Category 11 emissions. And this makes up around about 80% of total vehicle life cycle emissions. So if you can reduce the tailpipe emissions and reduce that 80% down to nothing, then you're doing a very good job at reducing the carbon intensity from the life cycle of a vehicle. So that's the first thing I would say. And in terms of the grids, the price or the cost per kilowatt of renewable power is often more inexpensive than fossil fuel alternatives. So the grid will continue to decarbonize, which will further enhance the green credentials associated with electric vehicles.
Ben Scott joining us from London today. You're a senior analyst at Carbon Tracker, focusing on the automotive sector. Thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
And that is our show for this week. Do get in touch with us on X, formerly known as Twitter. @VanierCyril is my handle. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, entire episodes as well for you to catch up on. That does it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Cyril Vanier from the whole team here in Doha. Thank you for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.